that's apparently within our community, that's not a common trait, even among those who write for a living. So I think it would be good to, maybe have a little higher level of reading comprehension. So when it comes to debt policy, I believe that is the board's prerogative. And I am against hiring an outside consultant. I make my living as a consultant. I understand how consultants work. I understand what the reasons they're hired for. One of the reasons they're hired is to shape the opinion of those that they're consulting for and to help sell ideas. I do consulting in corporate finance and technical. I mean, I don't believe that we need to hire an outside consultant to tell us how to pay our debt back. I have a plan to pay it back. I will present that in the press to all the board members, but we do not need to have someone come in from outside and tell us how to pay a few $1 million in debt when we have plenty of resources to do that without raising taxes. I would like to know how that decision was made to hire PFM, what board that went through to make that decision. We had a committee chair, acting committee chair, ask for a speaker, which was turned down. In this case, how much are we paying for PFM to come in and do this? Who asked for that? Where was that approved in a board or committee meeting? What is the procedure for us asking for outside consultants to basically tell the board how to make a decision that's there within their purview to make? I don't understand why we're having that come in. Furthermore, we set up a process to go through budget revisions. That process included going to the committees, having the committee make a recommendation to HR Finance, and then HR Finance voting on those to be included in the budget that's presented to the county. That is not the same as what this process went. I know it was said that you're following the process, but the process included this committee making a decision on whether that resolution that was unanimously voted on and approved by Health and Human Services to be put into the budget that was presented to the county or not. You did not do that. You deferred that. So I just don't think I am not in tune or not in alignment with the actions of this committee. Thank you.
Great. The decision to invite PFM was one that I made in talking with the finance director. They provide input into guiding the county's approach to borrowing and finances, and we thought that their input would be valuable when we consider how we deal with our fund balance policy. Our current fund balance policy would say that the fund balance would go to the capital improvement program. That was not necessarily the recommendation that came out of Health and Human Services, and we thought that it would be beneficial to bring them in, or at least I thought as committee chair that it would be beneficial to bring them in and have them discuss it with us, and also within that context is as we're approaching how we're financing our debt in the future, have them provide some input. And in talking with Christy and Administrator Leonard and others, I made the request of Christy to ask them to come. So that falls with me. I thought that it would be a worthwhile discussion, and Christy has reached out to them. Chair Gibson.
Okay, thank you. Well, first off, I take some of those comments pretty seriously. When you sit there and make comments that the social improvement fund was a slush fund, or that it was done intentionally, increasing revenue or reserves. First off, it wasn't done intentionally. It was done by accident when staff change turned over. And it was also approved by our auditor, and it wasn't mislabeling. It was what normally happened was that money that increased that was available, that wasn't restricted, would have rolled into CIP. That didn't happen for literally 3 years. And so to make the argument that it's sitting there or intentional or it was something nefarious is outright, crazy. Because it went through the auditor approved it. The staffing turned over in 2019. The one that was responsible for identifying the portion of the social improvement fund that would have rolled over into the CIP each of those years. Now that being said, it's going to be corrected when the next audit happens. Those dollars would roll over into CIP. One of the things that is being asserted here is that those dollars are for a slush fund. That doesn't make any sense when it's targeted inside the social improvement fund, especially when you look at the cost of putting a child in in one of the facilities, upwards to $500,000 a year if we had one, the children in the area that were needed special care. So I'm sorry that some people feel that way and make accusations and saying that there's nefarious actions going on when it's not in fact anything close to being true.
I just want to step in and say something. So I've heard comments by Baker and then the responsive comments. As I look over the agenda, I'm not really sure that, this discussion about this fund was properly agendized. So if this is something that you guys wish to discuss in greater detail, I would ask that you put it on an agenda item for a later time, because I was not aware that this was going to be discussed just by simply looking at this. So I would have to say that a member of the public looking at the agenda would not have been on notice that this would be a topic of discussion.
The
Corp Counsel has said that the budget is broad discussion and all topics related to that are valid for discussion in the past.
It's part of the social improvement fund, Dan, is part of
I
that.
think that the context is that the request from the Health and Human Services Committee was to take a portion of the social improvement fund and
Yes.
allocate it to reducing the levy. From that perspective, I think that the discussion is germane to the issue before us, because it would have the impact on the levy and what is published. So you haven't had the luxury of the past discussion, so I think it is. The chair would rule that it is germane at this time.
Okay, now, as long as it's germane to one of the topics on the agenda here, then that should be fine. Mike is unfortunately he's not here today, so I just dropped in last minute.
I appreciate your trying to integrity to the open meetings notification. Supervisor Baker.
I appreciate your suggestion as well. Are you comfortable with me proceeding?
I am.
Okay. So, one comment that I would like to make is that I have presented a graph which I think is fairly dramatic and has not been put into the packet and has not been shown on any, despite my request several times, it hasn't made it onto a screen that's viewed from any of the minutes to recordings. I would like that to be publicly shared.
I don't have it, so I'd have to have it to share it.
I sent it to Kelly.
I'm not Kelly,
No,
I
I
don't
can
have
send
it.
it to you.
thank you.
Supervisor Hart.
Thank you. One of the things, and it's kind of going back on this fund too, is I had pushed back too on that this is a slush fund. I mean, the Social Services Department is acting on a directive from the Families First Act that was passed, I think, in 2018. And as part of that, they are directed to prioritize placement of children with families and then also next of kin, which are less expensive, which means the social services budget per the directive of the federal government is going down year after year because they are making less expensive placements. And on top of that, we also have a mandated and non-mandated programs that are saving the social services department year after year as well. And that is going into these funds partially. And again, this is a matter of making sure that we don't straddle this board in the future with the possibility of a really expensive placement that could force us to increase the tax levy one year because we had a expensive or challenging placement that we couldn't afford the year before. So again, I just have to push back against that. The social improvement fund is a slush fund because it's clearly, it is not that.
Supervisor Baker.
So I have refrained from calling from a slush fund prior today, and I'm not saying that it's a slush fund. I'm suggesting it may be. I am saying that when I showed the graph to people, I got the staff response 4 times without me leading them to use that word. I have refrained from using that word prior today. I believe I did use it in one conversation a couple days ago. But other than that, I have not used that term. The question that I would like to ask in reference to a comment that was just made, or several comments. So I asked finance director to send me the procedures for doing KIP rollover, and she did that. It was my understanding that this actually does not fall within the KIP rollover once those funds are transferred out of the general fund. It would, Supervisor Robinson or HR Finance Chair Robinson, I've had this discussion before. I believe it probably fell within the intent of the KIP regulations, but I don't believe that it fell within the letter of the KIP regulations. And I don't know if Finance Director would like to comment, but when I went through those carefully, it looked to me like there was, try to choose my words carefully, a fairly large loophole by which that rollover could be avoided. And that is actually what led me to find this innocent increase in the social improvement fund. So I don't know if the finance director would care to elaborate on whether this actually does fall within the existing KIP instructions or not.
The social improvement fund or the
Correct.
spreadsheet that I showed?
Once the funds have been transferred, once the funds have been added to the social improvement fund through tax levy, I don't believe that according to the prior resolutions, all the prior guidance on KIP rollover, that they are actually part of that KIP calculation any longer.
They are, and the spreadsheet I showed you is the same one I've been doing probably for 5 to 6 years in that format. The reason that it wasn't rolled over is because we didn't have the estimate of how much really was county supported dollars in the social improvement fund, and that was because of staff turnover. Also, as we showed you the analysis, you have to go and manually try to figure out each programmatic area that you would have to do that. So it is all still sitting in the social improvement fund. And I believe that I think I'm answering your question right. It did not move, but that doesn't discount it or exclude it from rolling in the future once it's determined how much money would be available for CIP. And I think that calculation that was presented at county board is our estimate of what it should have been, but since it still sits within the social improvement fund, it is still available for use for CIP. So what happens is that you have audit, Then we do a calculation for or for working capital, which gets pulled off, and then the remaining amounts, which are in the general fund, debt service, all debt service, capital improvements rolls into capital improvements for unused funds, and then social improvement. So it would still be available once a determination has been made that it's not restricted. It would be, or it would be assigned or unassigned. So it's really still there for availability to be used as the policy shows, which is a CIP rollover.
So my understanding was that the SIP calculations were generally focused on the general fund and not the other funds. And also the second observation is that the CIP rollover calculation is internal. This is a question. I believe you've answered it for me before. But the CIP rollover calculation is an internal function, is not state function or audit
Correct.
function.
And I think I either put in a packet to the committee or maybe directly to you, Supervisor Baker, the 2024 CIP policy, which is the documentation of how that happens.
Correct, and that's what it is quite confusing, so I may not be interpreting it correctly. I would say that but my interpretation looking at the calculations that it was focused on the general fund, and fund dollars that were transferred into other funds were not generally considered in the CIP calculation.
Correct, and if you take a look just on the summary point of the balance sheet, a lot of times the general fund is where we, like, working capital resides in there, so a lot of times general fund typically is may be or may not be the sole governmental activity type fund that would have the unassigned fund balance at all times.
Chair Gibbs.
But historically, prior to 2019 and prior to the change in staffing, we were historically always rolling over out of the social improvement fund the portion that was identified that was not restricted by or because of state monies or federal monies.
Yes, and even as of beyond that is there's split out of social improvement funds. So I believe it was even in 2020 or 2021, we still have one additional transfer out, which was county supported portion of the child support funding, and that typically was about $250,000 a year.
So the point being is historically, prior to the change in staffing, the one that did the calculation of the social improvement fund portion that was available to roll into the CIP, it historically had been.
Yes.
Thank you.
And just to reiterate, again, we have a very old system, and now I believe to take a think, what will we do to change it by a modern system, which actually splits out, and you'll see it in the budget. The social improvement fund itself is being held by pretty much the operating fund now for the social services department, and grants are held separately, which is all government activity grants. So that also delineates a much clearer line on what's actually grant funded and what's actually part of operations within the social services department. So I think if you're gonna say going forward, what would you do? I think Workday's ability to track those with the new architecture is what we use to make sure that we are able to account for all of those items that are county supported activities within social services department. And social services department also equals social improvement fund because it's the only department within that fund. So I think to Supervisor Baker, I think in order to mitigate that in the future, I think that's what Workday will do for us, so that we have those. The architecture creates a much better way of being able to account for those in a way that we can demonstrate where the county fund portion of those programs lie.
Thank you.
Chair Gibbs.
Chair Robinson, I have a comment. This is Supervisor Marshall.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I would like to remind the committee that in a previous meeting, Administrator Leonard had supported using the Social Improvement Fund for setting up a reserve necessary if we would go to self-funding of our health care or our health insurance. So is clear that there's no specific procedure that regarding the social improvement fund prior to this meeting, because like I said, Administrator Leonard suggested that it would be a wonderful thing to set up the reserve needed to go to self-insurance.
I'm going to Chair Gibbs and then Administrator Leonard. I'm gonna...
All right, well, first off, thank you, Chairman. The thing, when we talk about, with Supervisor Baker made the comments about long-term debt service. And if we think back to what I had said on the last HR Finance Committee meeting, I talked about how we're going to manage the property tax rate for the citizens of Marathon County. And we look at the last 2 years, and we've had we've had a fair market value increase significant in the last 2 years. 11% and 11.3% in 1 year, 11% in another year. Prior to that, we have had a 2.4% increase, a 2% increase. Net rolling average, 10 years, 1.72% increase. And by virtue of the levy limits that are imposed by the state on us, our net new construction is the amount of net dollars, the increase in dollars, other than the new legislation that was just proposed as far as shared revenue, was the only revenue that the county could take. And that historically has not kept up with inflation, nor has it ever kept up with cost of health insurance increases. And so when we look at having a discussion about how we're going to manage that property tax rate over a long term, over the next 18 years of servicing roughly $100 million worth of debt, we can't take that in a vacuum and say that we're going to have 11% increase in valuation each year, therefore driving the tax rate down that we have. Historically, the last 2 years, we've driven the tax rate down. This year, with the proposal down to $3.99 with a debt service on debt levy of 900 and some thousand. And last year we used reserve to pay part of the debt. And if we don't have 11% increase in valuation next year, you potentially have a tax rate that's going to go up even with net new construction, especially if you sit there and look at and understand the total complexity of the budget. When you look at what we're doing this year to be able to pay for the CIP projects that are being proposed, we're using roughly $10 million of ARPA funding. Next year, and Supervisor Baker even did make this observation that when we use that the reserve for 2023 to pay that debt service, that would be affecting next year's rollover. And you're right, it will. It will affect 2024's rollover into the 2025 CIP. And so understanding that there's mandatory, or I shouldn't say mandatory, but there's items that we put on rolling stock that are absolutely necessary to be able to keep this county in business, keep the sheriff's cars rolling on the road, providing security. We have to look at how can we manage this debt long term and not just short term. Understanding that we're not going to have $10 million of ARPA funding next year to pay for CIP or rollover. We've heard loud and clear from the board that we're not going to borrow money. We're already borrowed max according to some people on this board, and I'm not debating that. But what I am debating is how we manage this debt long term, and that's why I think the understanding from the professionals and looking at the long-term solution that manages this debt so we do not have a huge spike in debt service or tax rate because we don't have net new construction going up significantly, or we don't have a valuation, equalized valuation going up significantly. So I'm sorry, but I think there's, the comment about the ability to utilize part of the social improvement fund for health insurance was made under observation that we have potentially $6 million in the social improvement fund that could roll over, and you have opportunities to use that. But if we continue to use it to spend down debt levy, we won't have those options. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize if my previous comments were inartful or perhaps led to confusion, but we, as I understand it, dovetailing with Christy, we do have a policy relative to the social improvement fund and the unrestricted portion of that rolling into CIP. My comments in previous meetings were simply to say that in conversations with a number of board members, there are kind of what I'll say are perhaps special projects that or desired uses of those funds that are not, that would require us to do something other than simply allow our policy to take effect. Whether it's Supervisor Baker's point of utilizing it to alleviate the debt levy increase that was proposed in this year's budget, or potentially serve as a funding source for a health insurance reserve, or as another supervisor indicated, setting up a fund for some projects with local municipalities to clean up dilapidated or otherwise contaminated sites. My suggestion was, in speaking with another colleague, not to say that you should do it because, again, you're the policy board, but another option would be something of a long-term debt management and large capital project fund, to seed funds for that. But I apologize if I led you to believe that that fund doesn't have a policy that governs rollover. As I understand it, it does. And for the reasons Christy referenced, hey, I own it. For everything that happened after January 1 of 2020, it's my fault. If we didn't follow a policy, I don't care if our system's old or if we had staff turnover, you absolutely should hold me accountable for that to the extent you feel I should be. We didn't roll over enough. So now we're here, we're being very transparent. We're not using it. Staff haven't spent any of those funds inappropriately. I think we did a very good job managing our budgets such that the fund grew, as Supervisor Baker's graph showed. The choice of what to do with it is 100% up to the board. To the extent we can bring you information to help you make the best policy decision you can, we're happy to do that, but at the end of the day, I just want to make very clear, I don't have, and that's not my decision, that's the board's. So if you want additional information, please let us know. But I apologize to the extent my comments were led anyone to believe that those funds can be utilized for anything outside of policy.
Christy, and then we're going to.
And also, I don't know what the conversation was with County Administrator Leonard and you, but you also do have, and it's in your budget book, you have your employee benefits fund, which does have capacity to help us transition from any type of health insurance. Health insurance is always going to be your biggest battle, irregardless of you're in a COVID era, you're in a, I've lived through the war on drugs, so we've taken money from the fund balance to support programming to try to do that. The jail has been an issue. Health insurance is always your number one issue that will come up. It's guaranteed because of the nature of it. It's outside of our control. But besides the social improvement fund, you do have your employee benefit fund, which is the first place you would go. And I would reiterate what County Administrator Leonard said. I should have been taking a look at that. We do have an old system. That money has not been spent. But this board has some ability and flexibility, which is what we've always tried to have, to make policy decisions going forward with not only that social improvement fund, your capital projects fund. We also have the employee benefit fund itself, which allows us to determine in the future whether or not self-funding of health is the way to go or not. And in the past, up to maybe about 2012, 10, 12, we were self-insured. So we have that capacity. We know how to do that. Just at this time, it was not feasible due to our experience with our own group. So I did want to say that may have been stated, but if you would ask me, technically you have not only social improvement, you also have your employee benefit fund. So these are things that the board in future years can determine what they want to do. Again, to reiterate County Administrator's comments, yes, we should have transferred some of those funds to the CIP in those years. It has not been used, it has not been spent, it is available, and that is where your default will go to use those CIP or those social improvement funds. But that also gives you the capacity to make decisions going forward to keep this county in its best financial position it can be, based on the things that come up in the future.
Supervisor Hart.
Thank you. One of the concerns in talking about all these funds too is, I'm afraid that we're setting precedents here because last year we paid for some debt servicing through fund balance. This year it's now being proposed again to pay for some debt servicing through fund balance. We're going to run out of fund balance eventually here, and I don't think it's a sustainable policy to continue to do that year after year, especially when the county has challenges. I mean, what I'm afraid of the long-term impacts of what happens if we have a major flooding event and we have road culvert washouts. What happens if we have a dilapidated building? I mean, we're in a building that the north side of this building, the walls are falling off. And these are real examples. This isn't like this is some like nebulous thing that could happen. These things have actually happened. So, I mean, those are all kind of examples of other funds that I'm afraid that could be used in the future. I just don't want to set up this precedence of using fund balances to pay for debt, because what's going to end up happening is we could have a major disaster in the future, and then we're going to have to actually put on more debt because we have raided all of our fund balances. Again, that's a long-term thing, but I'm really fearful of setting that precedence.
The issue before us today is adopting a resolution that will convey information relative to the tax levy. And that was in your packet, and we've heard information from others, but what are your wishes relative to the resolution before us? I think we should get a motion to get it on the table, and then we can talk about any amendments. Chair Gibbs.
Make a motion that we approve the debt levy as spelled out in the resolution in our packet.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Leonard. Any discussion or amendments?
Can I ask a clarifying question? Was that just to approve the debt levy or the overall budget levy?
Overall budget levy.
I think you said debt.
Budget and property tax levy resolution. Is that your intent?
That is my intent.
And the intent of the second? Any discussion? Chair Gibbs.
So I want to go back and revisit the actual property tax rate and understand what we have passed on to the taxpayers in the last 2 years. We'll go back to 2021, and our property tax rate was $4.55. Excuse me, that was 2022. In 2023, the property tax rate was $4.19. Now the proposal that we have, including debt levy, is $3.99. Now I'd like to extrapolate out of those increases. In 2023, our overall tax levy increased roughly 3%. Our net new construction in that same year was 1.728%. Now we think about those 1.728, that's new property that's being taxed. That's net. So net means that you take off everything that's being built, that's new, I call it new taxpayers. Everything that's being removed is something that is taken down and that's removed from the tax base. So if we think about that 1.28%, 1.728% as new taxpayers and a rate increase of 3%, when you take that down as net of 1.2%, 1.3%. Then let's go to the proposed budget of $3.99. The net new construction is 2.32%, and the overall increase is 5.68%. But let's take off the 2.32% because, again, that's new property that's being taxed. And if I build a $50,000 shed, I should expect my property taxes to go up based on that valuation of $50,000. So I'll call that, again, new taxpayers. So the 2 years that we've had huge growth in valuation in property, we had net new construction of 4.04%. We've had rate increases over the 2 years of roughly 8.8%. If we take the one from the other and we take the net new construction or the new taxpayers, if we'll call it something, and subtract it from our total overall rate increase, that includes covering the debt that is being proposed to be covered by this budget, we're increasing 4% over 2 years, above and beyond net new construction. I would love to be able to see, because I've done some research on school districts, on the tech, on WASA, on utilities, and just inflationary factors. And if you look at 2% increase of net, the taxpayers in Marathon County are getting a great bargain. In comparison to what, and I'm not bashing school districts, they have literally one revenue source, and that's property tax, and a shared revenue from the state, that's it. So, but my point is the taxpayers are asked in this proposed budget over the last 2 years to increase the dollars that they pay by 2%. I don't believe that that is a overtaxing of those individuals. It is, again, trying to set up long-term sustainability to cover the improvements that we have made, this board has made, to the buildings that this county has and owns and looks to increase the service that we've done. And I want to thank the administrator for his hard work on creating this budget and all of the departments. Thank you.
Any other questions? And again, this is, the resolution before us is the publication in the paper. And this committee and other standing committees in the county board are the ultimate determiners of what that budget will be, and there will be, it would be nice to have more time between introduction and this point, but we don't have that time, and we need to provide the legal notice. I this committee will continue to look at it. We will continue to look at how we might use the funds, what that fund policy will be with PFM. And we will be bringing amendments in pending county board action and, on other items. So this is part of the process, not the end of the process. Any other amendments or discussion? If not, all those in favor of adoption of the motion to approve the publication of the budget and tax rate will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. And then the budget resolution for appropriation unit, that's basically what we just did. All right. So we will then have our meeting on the 24th. Again, will be dedicated to the budget. And again, until the budget is finalized, it's open and amendments are appropriate. What will happen from this point forward is that the budget will be presented as published. However, amendments will be considered, and last year I believe this committee offered an amendment, and others can offer amendments that would incorporate our review. And ultimately, it is what the county board adopts. So, anything else for future meetings?
Just to let you know,
Chair vote.
any budget amendments that are proposed, Corp Counsel Mike has put a template out and we can get that to the members. Our responsibility is to put it in a format that's legal, but it's all uniform format, and that the numbers we're gonna help with just the technical assistance for the formatting, the language and the numbers. So anybody that would wish to do that, we have a budget template. That's way then they all are uniform and look similar. But anything that comes up, you can use that format.
Is that Supervisor Marshall?
Yes, I just had a request that I'm certain that when the commitment for the nursing home and other improvements at North Central Healthcare were taken upon, that there was some plan to pay back the debt. It would be helpful to see what was the original plan to pay back the debt for that project that was undertaken in 2019.
So we're going to incorporate, I think that's an appropriate request, and we'll do that, try to put that together for the 24th.
Thank you.
Anything else? If not, then our next meeting is the 24th at 3. The issue of adjournment is before us. What are your wishes? Supervisor Hart. Second by Chair Gibbs. All those in favor of adjournment will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries.